The last ember of daylight bled across the barren Texas horizon as Fiona Dawson clutched her infant son to her chest, each labored breath forming a cloud in the bitter cold of the October evening, 1875. The journey that had brought her to this desolate outpost had cost her everything: her husband, her home, and now, quite possibly, her life. The stagecoach had abandoned her here at Fort Griffin's outskirts when her water broke 2 days ago. The driver, unsympathetic to her predicament, had simply tossed her trunk beside her and continued on his route, leaving a woman in labor alone in the wilderness. She had managed to deliver her child herself, tearing strips from her petticoat to fashion swaddling clothes for the tiny boy she named Peter. Now, as night descended and temperatures plummeted, she pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around them both. The baby's cries had grown weaker over the past hours, and Fiona feared the worst. 23 years on this earth, and this was how it would end, frozen beside the trail with her newborn son. "Please," she whispered into the gathering darkness, her voice barely audible above the whistling wind. "Someone help us." As if in answer, hoofbeats pounded in the distance, growing louder. Fiona tensed, knowing that not all travelers meant well to a woman alone. She curled protectively around Peter, determined that whatever came, she would defend her child with her last breath. The rider appeared as a silhouette against the purple sky, tall in the saddle, the brim of his hat pulled low. He drew his horse to a stop several yards away, and Fiona could feel his eyes assessing the scene: a woman huddled by the side of the trail, a small trunk beside her, and the unmistakable bundle of an infant in her arms. "Madam," the voice was deep, cautious, "you need assistance." Fiona swallowed hard, pride warring with desperation. "My baby," she managed. "He's so cold." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, and as he approached, Fiona could make out more details: broad shoulders, a weathered face, eyes that seemed to catch what little light remained. Not a young man, but not old either. Mid-30s perhaps, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. He knelt beside her, and she caught the scent of leather, horses, and wood smoke. Gentle hands reached toward the bundle, but he paused, awaiting permission. "May I?" he asked. Fiona nodded, reluctantly loosening her grip on Peter. The stranger carefully took the baby, examining him with knowing eyes. "He's chilled but strong," he pronounced. "Born recently? 2 days ago," Fiona whispered. "The stagecoach left us." Something dark passed across the man's face. "Animals," he muttered, then turned his attention back to her. "Name's Xavier James. Most folks call me Zav. I've got a cabin about 3 miles from here. Not much, but it's warm and I've got provisions." He hesitated. "Madam, you and your little one won't survive the night out here." Fiona hesitated. Her mother had raised her to be cautious of strangers, especially men, but the alternative was certain death for Peter. And there was something in Xavier James's eyes that spoke of honesty, of decency. "Fiona," she said finally. "Fiona Dawson, and this is Peter." Xavier nodded, handing the baby back to her. "Hold him close to your body heat, Mrs. Dawson. I'll get you both to safety." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then flushed. "His father. He didn't survive the journey west." Xavier's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Dawson." He glanced at her trunk. "Is this all your belongings?" When Fiona nodded, he secured the trunk to his horse, then returned to her side. "Can you stand?" It took all her remaining strength to get to her feet, and even then, she swayed dangerously. Without comment, Xavier swept her into his arms, baby and all, and carried her to his horse. With impressive strength, he managed to mount while still holding her, settling her in front of him in the saddle. "Hold onto the horn," he instructed, wrapping one arm securely around her waist while the other took the reins. "And hold that little one tight. We'll be home soon." The ride passed in a blur for Fiona, her consciousness fading in and out. The warmth of the man behind her and the steady rhythm of the horse were the only constants as the landscape grew darker around them. At some point, she must have lost consciousness entirely, because she awakened to find herself being carried again, this time toward a small log cabin silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a narrow bed stood in the corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Xavier laid her gently on the bed, then immediately set about building up the fire. "Rest," he said, his back to her as he worked. "I'll heat some broth and find something to make a cradle for the little one." Fiona wanted to thank him, to ask questions, to explain herself, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. When she awoke again, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window. For a moment she panicked, reaching for Peter, but her hands found only empty blankets. "He's right here," came Xavier's voice from across the room. Fiona turned to see him sitting in a rocking chair she hadn't noticed the night before, her son cradled expertly in his large hands. Been giving him sugar water. He took to it well. Hungry little fellow. Relief flooded through Fiona, followed swiftly by shame. I should be caring for him. "You needed rest," Xavier said simply, "and I've helped birth enough foals and calves to know my way around newborns." He rose and brought Peter to her. "But he'll be wanting his mother now." As Fiona took her son, their fingers brushed, and she was struck by the contrast. Her small, pale hands against his sun darkened, calloused ones. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time in full daylight. They were gray, she realized, like the sky before a storm. "No need for thanks," he replied, turning away to give her privacy as she arranged Peter to nurse. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Fiona said softly, "but in my experience, decent men are rare treasures." Xavier busied himself at the small stove, his broad back to her. "I've made oatmeal, and there's coffee. You'll need to keep up your strength if you're nursing." The domesticity of the scene struck Fiona suddenly, this stranger cooking for her, caring for her child while she lay in his bed. The impropriety of it all should have horrified her, but all she felt was gratitude. "I don't want to impose," she began. "If you could direct me to the nearest town, Fort Griffin's the closest settlement," Xavier interrupted, "and it's no place for a woman alone with a newborn." He set a bowl of oatmeal beside her. "Town's full of buffalo hunters, gamblers, and worse. They call it the Flat, and it's earned its reputation as the wildest town in Texas." Fiona's heart sank. She had so little money and now no prospects. "I need to find work," she said. "I was told there might be positions for teachers or seamstresses." Xavier looked at her thoughtfully. "There's a respectable part of town. The fort itself houses soldiers and their families, but finding lodgings and work with a newborn." He shook his head. "Winter's coming on fast this year. Stay here until spring. The cabin's small, but I can make up a pallet for myself by the fire. You and the boy can have the bed." "I couldn't possibly," Fiona began. "Miss Dawson," Xavier said gently, "I've lived alone for 8 years now. I won't pretend it wouldn't be an adjustment having you and the little one here, but I've got food enough and the cabin's sound. Come spring, if you still want to try your luck in town, I'll take you there myself." Fiona studied him, trying to discern his motives. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I had a sister once," he finally said. "She went west with her husband, looking for gold in California, never heard from her again." He refocused on Fiona. "Maybe she found someone to help her along the way. Maybe not. Either way, I'd like to think I'm balancing the scales a bit." The simple honesty in his words moved her. "We would pay our way," she insisted. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. James." A small smile crossed his face. "Xav," he corrected. "And I don't doubt your abilities, Miss Dawson, but your job right now is healing and caring for your son. We can discuss the rest later." And so it was decided, with the practicality that frontier life demanded. Fiona and Peter would winter with Xavier James, and come spring, they would reassess their situation. It was an unusual arrangement, but the West made its own rules about propriety when survival was at stake. The first weeks passed in a blur of adjustment. True to his word, Xavier made a pallet for himself near the fire and gave Fiona and Peter the bed. He rose before dawn each day to tend to his small herd of cattle and the 2 horses he kept, returning mid-morning to check on his guests before heading out again to hunt or chop wood. Fiona, meanwhile, recovered her strength gradually. Peter thrived under their combined care, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. By the time he was a month old, he had developed a surprisingly strong grip and a habit of staring intently at Xavier whenever the man was in the cabin, as if studying him. He's going to be a keen observer, Xavier remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, Peter cradled in Fiona's arms. Good quality in these parts. He seems fascinated by you, Fiona said, smiling as the baby's eyes tracked Xavier's movements. Probably just trying to figure out why there's a bear in his house, Xavier replied, stroking his beard self-consciously. Fiona laughed, the sound surprising them both. It occurred to her that it might be the first time she had truly laughed since her husband Thomas had fallen ill on the trail months ago. The realization sobered her. Would you tell me about him? Xavier asked quietly, sensing her change in mood. Peter's father? Fiona hesitated, then nodded. His name was Thomas Dawson. We married young. I was 17, he was 20. He worked as a clerk in my father's dry goods store in Virginia. She paused, memories washing over her. After the war, things were difficult. Thomas had served in the Confederate Army, just a boy really. He came back. Changed. We struggled for years, then heard about opportunities out west. Xavier listened silently, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. We sold everything, joined a wagon train. Fiona swallowed hard. Thomas took sick 3 months into the journey, fever. By the time we reached Kansas, he was gone. The others, they were kind enough, but they couldn't wait. One family offered to take me back east, but what was there to go back to? So I continued on, thinking I could make a new start for myself and the baby. You're a brave woman, Fiona Dawson, Xavier said softly. She shook her head. Not brave, desperate perhaps, stubborn certainly. Same thing out here, he replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, would you like to know how I ended up in this God-forsaken place? Fiona nodded, grateful for the change of subject. I was Army, Xavier began, his voice taking on a distant quality. Came west after the war, the same one your Thomas fought in, though I wore blue, not gray. Served at Fort Griffin for 5 years, mostly tracking Comanche raiding parties. He rubbed absently at his left thigh, and Fiona noticed for the first time the slight stiffness in his gait. Took an arrow here in 70. Army surgeon said I'd never ride well enough for cavalry again, so I mustered out. And you stayed, Fiona prompted when he fell silent. Xavier nodded. Had nowhere particular to go back to. Pennsylvania, coal countries where I was born, but my folks passed during the war. No siblings except that sister I mentioned. He gestured around the cabin. Built this place, bought a few head of cattle. It's a quiet life, but it suits me. As he spoke, Peter began to fuss. Fiona rocked him gently, but his cries intensified. May I? Xavier asked, extending his hands. Fiona passed the baby over, watching in amazement as Xavier tucked Peter against his broad chest, one large hand supporting the tiny head. He began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that nevertheless seemed to soothe the infant. Within minutes, Peter's eyes were drooping. You have a way with him, Fiona observed. Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. He's easy to please, aren't you, little man? He murmured to the now sleeping baby. Something shifted in Fiona's heart as she watched them, this large, solitary man and her tiny son. Perhaps it was gratitude, or perhaps something deeper beginning to take root. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to examine it too closely. As November turned to December, the weather grew harsher. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the brown prairie into a glittering white expanse that dazzled the eyes on sunny days. Inside the cabin, Fiona and Xavier developed a routine that worked for them both. She had insisted on taking over the cooking and mending, refusing to be a burden, and he had graciously accepted her help while still maintaining that her primary duty was to Peter. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Xavier returned from tending the livestock in the small barn. He stamped the snow from his boots at the door, his cheeks ruddy with cold. Animals are settled, he reported, hanging his coat on a peg. But we're in for a long night. Winds coming from the north hard. Fiona nodded, stirring the stew that simmered over the fire. I've heated water for you to wash, she said, gesturing to a basin on the table. Dinner will be ready soon. Xavier paused, looking at her with an unreadable expression. You know, he said finally, I could get used to coming in from the cold to this. The simple statement held layers of meaning that neither of them was prepared to address. Instead, Fiona busied herself with setting the table while Xavier washed his hands and face. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or Peter, who slept peacefully in the cradle Xavier had fashioned for him from a wooden crate lined with soft rabbit furs. As they finished their meal, Xavier cleared his throat. "Christmas is coming," he said. "Not that I usually make much of it out here alone, but I thought, well, with the little one, we might do something to mark the day." Fiona looked up in surprise. She had lost track of the dates during her ordeal and recovery. "Is it December already?" Xavier nodded. 17th today. I was thinking I might ride into town when the weather clears, pick up a few things." "That would be lovely," Fiona said, touched by his thoughtfulness, "though I have nothing to give you in return." "You've given this old cabin more life in 2 months than it's seen in 8 years, Xavier replied simply. "That's gift enough." The sincerity in his voice caused a warm flush to spread across Fiona's cheeks. "You're too kind, Xav." It was the first time she had used his shortened name, and it hung in the air between them, a small but significant shift in their relationship. Xavier rose abruptly, moving to the fire to add another log. "Not kind," he said, his back to her. "Just honest." 3 days later, the storm finally broke, and Xavier prepared to ride to Fort Griffin. Before he left, he showed Fiona where he kept his rifle and how to use it. "I don't expect trouble," he assured her, "but better you know how to protect yourself and Peter if needed." Fiona handled the weapon gingerly. She had never fired a gun before, but the harsh realities of frontier life didn't allow for such genteel reservations. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. 2 days at most," Xavier promised. "I've split enough wood to keep you warm, and there's plenty of food. Keep the door barred at night." After he departed, the cabin felt strangely empty despite Peter's presence. Fiona moved through her tasks mechanically, constantly finding herself glancing out the window for signs of Xavier's return. It was foolish. She knew he had been gone barely hours, but she couldn't help herself. That night, she slept poorly, startling at every creak of the cabin's timbers and howl of the wind. By morning, she was exhausted but determined to maintain her usual routine. She fed Peter, prepared a simple breakfast for herself, and was just settling in to mend one of Xavier's shirts when a knock came at the door. Fiona froze. Xavier wouldn't knock at his own door. She set Peter in his cradle and reached for the rifle, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" She called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. James," came a woman's voice. "I'm Elizabeth Morgan from the fort. Your husband asked me to check on you while he's detained in town." Fiona hesitated, confusion washing over her. "Mrs. James." Xavier had apparently presented her as his wife to the townspeople. And who was this woman? Cautiously, rifle still in hand, Fiona approached the door. "Mr. James didn't mention sending anyone," she said. There was a pause then. "He was concerned about the weather turning again. Said you were alone with a new baby. Please, it's bitterly cold out here." Fiona made a decision, lowering the rifle but keeping it within reach as she unbarred the door. Standing on the threshold was a woman perhaps 10 years her senior, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. Her kind face was pinched with cold and she held a covered basket. "Oh my," the woman said, taking in the rifle. "Xavier said you were careful, but I see he wasn't exaggerating." "I'm sorry," Fiona said, stepping back to allow her visitor entry. "One can't be too cautious out here." Elizabeth Morgan smiled, unwinding her scarf as she entered. "No apology needed, my dear. I brought you some things from town: fresh bread, preserves, and a bit of calico I thought you might like for the baby." As the woman set her basket on the table, Fiona wrestled with how to address the misunderstanding. "Mrs. Morgan, I think there's been a confusion. I'm not Mrs. James. My name is Fiona Dawson. Xavier has kindly taken me and my son in until spring." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she recovered quickly. "I see. Well, that explains a few things. Xavier was quite vague about his family situation when he came into the general store yesterday." Her eyes twinkled. "My husband owns the establishment, you see, and Xavier's never been one for gossip. Just said he needed supplies for his wife and newborn." Fiona felt her cheeks burning. "I assure you, our arrangement is purely practical. I was stranded, and he offered shelter for the winter." "Of course," Elizabeth said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Xavier James has always been a gentleman. one of the few truly honorable men in these parts. She glanced around the cabin, though I must say I've never seen his place looking so homey. Fiona followed her gaze, seeing the cabin through fresh eyes, the curtains she had fashioned from an old sheet, the carefully arranged cooking utensils, the small touches that had transformed the bachelor dwelling into something approaching a home. When can we expect Xavier back? Elizabeth asked, changing the subject. Tomorrow, he said, Fiona replied, unless the weather turns. Elizabeth nodded. The reason I came besides Xavier's request is to invite you both to Christmas dinner at the fort. Several of the officers' families gather, and we'd be delighted to have you join us. The invitation caught Fiona off guard. She hadn't considered socializing, had assumed their isolation was as much for propriety's sake as for practicality. That's very kind, but I'm not sure. Think about it, Elizabeth interrupted gently. It would do you good to see some new faces, and everyone is curious about the woman who finally captured Xavier James's attention. Despite Fiona's protests, Elizabeth departed clearly unconvinced that there wasn't more to the situation than met the eye. Her visit left Fiona unsettled, wondering what exactly Xavier had told the people in town and why he had presented her as his wife. When he returned the following day, his horse laden with supplies, Fiona was waiting with questions burning on her tongue. But they died unasked when she saw his face drawn with fatigue, a fresh bruise blooming along his jaw. What happened? She gasped, taking his coat as he stepped inside. Xavier shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. Difference of opinion with some buffalo hunters in the saloon, he said dismissively. Nothing serious. It looks serious enough, Fiona replied, guiding him to a chair. Sit, let me tend to it. Xavier complied, watching her as she fetched water and a cloth. As she gently cleaned the bruise, she could smell whiskey on his breath, though he showed no signs of drunkenness. Mrs. Morgan came to visit, she said, keeping her tone neutral. She seemed under the impression that I was Mrs. James. Xavier closed his eyes briefly. Ah, he said. I can explain that. Please do, Fiona prompted, stepping back to assess her handiwork. Fort Griffin isn't known for its progressive attitudes toward unconventional living arrangements, Xavier said slowly. I thought it would be simpler, safer for you both if people believed you were my wife. A widow alone with a child would draw unwanted attention. Fiona considered this. There was logic in his reasoning, she had to admit. You might have discussed it with me first. You're right, he acknowledged immediately. I didn't think it through, I apologize. His ready admission disarmed her irritation. Mrs. Morgan invited us to Christmas dinner at the fort, she said, changing the subject. Xavier looked surprised. Did she? The Morgans hosted every year, but I've never attended. He studied her face. Would you like to go? Fiona hesitated. Would it not be awkward, continuing this deception? Probably, Xavier admitted, but it might be good for you to meet some of the more respectable residents. The officers' wives could be useful connections when spring comes. The reminder of their temporary arrangement sent an unexpected pang through Fiona's heart. Then perhaps we should accept, she said, turning away to hide her confusion. Xavier reached for her hand, stopping her retreat. Fiona, he said softly, about the town I was protecting you both the only way I knew how. I'm sorry if I overstepped. His hand was warm around hers, calloused but gentle. I understand, she said, meeting his eyes, and I'm grateful for everything. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of feelings beginning to grow beyond gratitude and duty. But neither was ready to give voice to it, and the moment passed as Peter's cries demanded Fiona's attention. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with small preparations. Xavier had brought back not only practical supplies, but also a few luxuries: sugar, dried apples, and even a small bag of peppermint candies. Fiona used some of the calico from Elizabeth to fashion a tiny cap for Peter, and secretly worked on a new kerchief for Xavier, embroidering his initials in one corner. On Christmas Eve, a light snow fell, blanketing the world in fresh white. After dinner, Xavier produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. I know it's traditional to wait until morning, he said, somewhat awkwardly, but I wanted you to have this tonight. Fiona accepted the package with surprise. You didn't need to get me anything. Open it, he urged. Inside was a small silver locket on a delicate chain. Fiona gasped as she opened it to find it empty, waiting for mementos. "I thought," Xavier said hesitantly, "when we get to town, perhaps someone could make a small sketch of Peter to put inside. And maybe, someday, someone you care for on the other side." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Fiona's eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Help me put it on." Xavier took the necklace, his fingers brushing her neck as he fastened the clasp. The touch sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill. "I have something for you as well," she said, retrieving the kerchief from its hiding place. "It's not much compared to your gift, but it's perfect," Xavier interrupted, running his thumb over the embroidered initials. "No one has made anything for me since my mother passed." The vulnerability in his admission touched Fiona deeply. On impulse, she rose on tiptoe and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Xav." His gray eyes darkened as he looked down at her, and for a breathless moment, Fiona thought he might kiss her properly. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should turn in early if we're to make it to the fort for dinner tomorrow," he said, his voice rougher than usual. That night, as Fiona lay in bed listening to Xavier's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, she found herself wondering how their lives might have been different if they had met under other circumstances, if she hadn't been recently widowed and vulnerable, if he hadn't been her rescuer and protector. Would they have recognized something in each other worth pursuing? Or would they have passed like ships in the night, unaware of what might have been? Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. They set out for Fort Griffin mid-morning, Peter bundled securely against Fiona's chest, Xavier leading the horse carefully over the snow-covered trail. They had decided to maintain the pretense of marriage for simplicity's sake, agreeing on a basic story that they had married in the East and journeyed west for a fresh start. "Remember," Xavier said as they approached the fort's imposing walls, "most of these people have never met me socially. I was just a cavalry officer to them, then a reclusive rancher. They have no reason to doubt our story." Fiona nodded, adjusting her shawl nervously. "And Peter, born on the trail, just as he was," Xavier replied. "The timing works well enough. You've been here nearly 3 months now." The Morgans' quarters within the fort were modest, but festively decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Elizabeth greeted them warmly, exclaiming over Peter's growth since she had seen him. "And Xavier," she said, taking in his freshly shaven face and carefully combed hair, "I hardly recognized you without the beard. Fiona must be a good influence." Xavier touched his smooth chin self-consciously. "Thought it was time for a change," he mumbled. Fiona had been equally surprised when he had emerged that morning sans beard, revealing a strong jaw and a small scar on his left cheek she hadn't known existed. The transformation made him look younger, more approachable, and admittedly even more handsome than before. The gathering included 3 other couples, all officers and their wives, and several children of various ages. Fiona found herself separated from Xavier as the women cooed over Peter and the men discussed the harsh winter and its effects on cattle. "Your Xavier seems different," Elizabeth commented quietly as they prepared plates for the meal. "More at ease, marriage suits him." Fiona busied herself arranging slices of ham to hide her discomfort with the deception. "He's a good man," she said truthfully. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. "And clearly besotted with you. He hasn't taken his eyes off you since you arrived." Startled, Fiona glanced across the room to find that Xavier was indeed watching her, a soft expression on his face that made her heart stutter. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, but offered a small smile that felt like a private communication between them. The dinner was lively, the conversation flowing freely as the excellent food and occasional glasses of Christmas punch loosened tongues. Fiona found herself genuinely enjoying the company, particularly that of Captain Morgan's sister, a forthright spinster named Harriet who had fascinating stories about her travels throughout the territories. "You should consider teaching at the fort school when spring comes," Harriet suggested when Fiona mentioned her education. "The current schoolmistress is returning east in April, and they'll need a replacement." The possibility kindled excitement in Fiona. "Do you think they would consider me?" "With a baby," Harriet nodded decisively. With your background and evident refinement, absolutely. And from what I hear, your husband's reputation as a former cavalry officer and respected rancher would only help your case. The reminder of their fabricated marriage cast a shadow over Fiona's enthusiasm. What would happen when spring came and she moved to town? The deception would have to end, and with it, perhaps, any chance of the position Harriet described. As the evening drew to a close, one of the officers suggested singing carols. Mrs. Morgan took her place at the small piano and the group gathered around. Xavier came to stand beside Fiona, who had Peter sleeping against her shoulder. "Having a good time?" he asked softly. Fiona nodded. "They're lovely people. You should have attended these gatherings before." Xavier's gaze was warm as it rested on her face. "Didn't have a reason to before," he said simply. The implications of his words sent heat coursing through Fiona. Before she could respond, the piano began, and the group launched into Silent Night. Xavier's deep voice joined the others, surprisingly melodious for a man who claimed no musical talents. As they sang, his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they had been doing it for years. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the gathering and the music, with Peter's weight against her and Xavier's solid presence beside her, Fiona felt a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape, creating a scene of ethereal beauty that seemed to exist outside of time. "Thank you for today," Fiona said as they approached the cabin. "It was wonderful to meet everyone." Xavier helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "They all adored you," he said. "Especially Harriet Morgan. She talked my ear off about what an excellent schoolmistress you would make." Fiona ducked her head. "She mentioned the position to me as well, but I don't see how I could apply given our situation." Xavier was quiet as he unsaddled the horse and led it into the small barn. When he returned to the cabin, Fiona had put Peter down and was stoking the fire back to life. "About that," Xavier said, removing his coat. "I've been thinking." Fiona turned to face him, her heart suddenly pounding. "Yes." He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Fiona, I know this isn't conventional. Nothing about our situation has been, but these past months." He trailed off, searching for words. "Yes," she prompted again, hardly daring to breathe. "I've grown to care for you," he said finally. "For both of you, more than I thought possible. The idea of you leaving in spring." He shook his head. "I don't want to think about it." Hope bloomed in Fiona's chest, but caution tempered it. "Xav, you've been so kind to us." "Perhaps what you're feeling is just, it's not pity or obligation," he interrupted, stepping closer. "Fiona, I know the difference between duty and," he hesitated, "and deeper feelings." "What are you saying?" she whispered. Xavier took her hands in his. "I'm saying that the story we told today doesn't have to be a lie. It could be real, if you wanted it to be." Fiona stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you could see a future with me," he clarified. "Not out of necessity or convenience, but because you might feel something for me too." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I'm not asking for an answer now, just think about it." Fiona's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. She had been a widow for less than a year, had known Xavier for only 3 months. And yet in that time he had shown her more kindness, more respect, more genuine care than most men showed in a lifetime. "I will think about it," she promised, squeezing his hands. "But Xav, you should know. I do care for you, very much." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "That's enough for now," he said softly. That night, Fiona lay awake long after Xavier's breathing had deepened into sleep. Her hand kept straying to the locket around her neck, thinking of his words. Could she love again? Did she already? The answers weren't simple, but as she drifted finally toward sleep, she realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was looking toward the future with hope rather than dread. January brought bitter cold and days when venturing outside was impossible. Confined to the cabin, Xavier and Fiona found new rhythms to their coexistence. He taught her to play checkers, she read aloud from the few books he owned, and together they watched Peter grow stronger and more alert by the day. The subject of Xavier's proposal hung between them, unmentioned but ever present. He was true to his word, not pressing for an answer, but Fiona often caught him watching her with a question in his eyes. One evening, as a howling blizzard raged outside, Xavier sat by the fire whittling a small wooden horse while Fiona mended one of his shirts. Peter lay on a blanket between them, kicking his feet and cooing. "He's going to be moving around before we know it," Xavier observed, pausing in his work to wiggle a finger at the baby, who grasped it firmly. "Strong little fellow." Fiona smiled, watching the interaction. "He adores you," she said softly. Xavier's expression grew serious. "I've grown to think of him as..." He hesitated. "Well, I care for him as if he were my own." The simple admission touched Fiona deeply. She set aside her mending and moved to kneel beside Xavier's chair. "You've been more of a father to him in these few months than many men are in a lifetime," she said. Xavier's hand came up to cup her cheek. "Fiona," he began, but was interrupted by a sudden pounding at the door. They both froze. No one traveled in such weather unless desperate. Xavier rose quickly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay back," he instructed, moving to the door. "Who's there?" he called. "Help, please," came a muffled voice, nearly lost in the wind. "Our wagon overturned." Xavier glanced at Fiona, who had gathered Peter into her arms. With a nod, he unbarred the door, rifle at the ready. A gust of snow and bitter cold swept in, along with a man supporting a heavily pregnant woman. Both were half frozen, their clothes inadequate for the brutal weather. "Thank God," the man gasped. "Didn't think we'd make it, saw your light." "Get her by the fire," Xavier ordered, taking the woman's other arm. Fiona, blankets. The next hours were a blur of activity. The couple, James and Mary Wilson, had been traveling to Fort Griffin when their wagon had overturned in a drift. They had managed to free their horse and continue on foot, but Mary, 8 months pregnant, was in distress. "The baby's coming," she gasped as another contraction seized her. Too early. Fiona, who had experienced childbirth so recently herself, took charge. "Xav, we'll need hot water, clean cloths. Mr. Wilson, help your wife onto the bed." For hours, Fiona coached Mary through the increasingly rapid contractions while Xavier and James Wilson kept the fire blazing and followed her instructions. Peter, remarkably, slept through most of the commotion in his cradle. Near dawn, with a final cry of pain and effort, Mary Wilson brought her daughter into the world tiny but alive, with a lusty cry that belied her premature arrival. "A miracle," James Wilson kept saying, tears streaming down his weathered face as he gazed at his wife and child. "A Christmas miracle, even if it's January." Exhausted but exhilarated, Fiona finally stepped back, allowing the new family their private moment. She found Xavier watching her from across the room, his eyes filled with something that made her breath catch: pride, admiration, and something deeper. As the storm finally began to abate and the Wilsons rested, Xavier pulled Fiona aside. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "You saved them both." Fiona shook her head. "Mary did the hard part. I just remembered what the midwife told me during my own labor." Xavier's hand found hers. "Still, not everyone would have known what to do or kept so calm." He hesitated. "Watching you tonight, I realized something." "What's that?" Fiona asked, suddenly breathless. "That I don't just care for you, Fiona Dawson," he said, his voice low and intense. "I love you, have probably loved you since that first night when you trusted me enough to let me bring you and Peter home." The declaration, so simple and heartfelt, broke the last of Fiona's hesitation. "Xav," she whispered, "I love you too. I think I've known it for weeks but was afraid to admit it, even to myself." Joy transformed his face. "Then will you marry me? Be my wife in truth, not just in the stories we tell in town." "Yes," Fiona said, the word carrying all the certainty she felt. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier James." He gathered her into his arms then, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening as she responded. It was a kiss of promise, of future, of home found after long wandering. The Wilsons stayed for 3 days until Mary was strong enough to travel and the weather cleared sufficiently. During that time, plans were made Xavier would take them all to Fort Griffin as soon as possible, where the Wilsons could arrange for a new wagon, and where Reverend Thompson could perform a wedding ceremony for Xavier and Fiona. "You're sure about this?" Xavier asked Fiona the night before their planned departure. It hasn't even been a year since your husband's passing. No one would blame you for wanting to wait. Fiona considered his words carefully. Thomas would want Peter and me to be happy, to be safe, she said finally. And I believe he would approve of you, Xav. You're a good man, the kind he respected. She took his hand. I'll always honor his memory, but my heart has found its new home with you. The journey to Fort Griffin the next day was slow but uneventful. The fort's small chapel was secured for the following afternoon, and Elizabeth Morgan took charge of arrangements, delighted that the marriage she had believed in at Christmas would be formalized properly. I knew there was something special between you two, she told Fiona as she helped her prepare in the Morgans' quarters. The way he looks at you like you're water in the desert. Fiona blushed, smoothing the borrowed dress, a simple blue wool that Elizabeth had insisted brought out her eyes. He saved us, she said softly. Peter and me. I don't know what would have become of us if he hadn't found us that night. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. And you saved him right back, my dear. 8 years alone in that cabin was turning him into a hermit. Now look at him shaved, sociable, even smiling occasionally. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, attended by the Morgans, the Wilsons, Harriet, and a few of the officers Xavier had served with. Peter, dressed in his finest, and only cap and gown, was held by Elizabeth, who had appointed herself honorary grandmother. Reverend Thompson, a gruff former army chaplain, kept the service traditional, but added his own frontier practicality. Marriage out here isn't for the faint of heart, he told the small gathering. It's a partnership against the elements, against hardship, against loneliness. These two have already faced more together than many couples do in years of marriage. They've built a foundation on mutual respect and genuine affection, the only true basis for lasting happiness. As Xavier slipped a simple gold band onto Fiona's finger purchased that morning from the fort's general store, she felt tears of joy pricking her eyes. From abandoned and desperate on the outskirts of town to beloved wife and mother, all in the span of 3 short months. Life's paths were indeed unpredictable. That night, in a small room at the fort's guest quarters, a wedding gift from Captain Morgan, Xavier and Fiona began their married life properly. Their lovemaking was tender, discovering, occasionally awkward, but ultimately deeply satisfying for them both. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Peter sleeping peacefully in his makeshift bed nearby, Fiona felt a contentment she had never known was possible. I never expected to find this again, she murmured against Xavier's chest. A home, a family. Xavier's arms tightened around her. When I found you that night, I thought I was just doing what any decent man would do, he said. I never imagined you would change my life so completely. He kissed her forehead. Thank you for trusting me, Fiona James. The name, her new name, sent a shiver of pleasure through her. I think I trusted you from the first moment, she admitted. There was something in your eyes, kindness, honesty. Even half frozen and terrified, I could see that. They returned to the cabin 2 days later, now legally husband and wife. The small dwelling felt different, somehow truly a home now, not just a temporary shelter. Xavier had arranged for Fiona to interview for the teaching position in April, and the school board had been enthusiastic about her qualifications. She would teach 3 days a week once the position opened, bringing Peter with her until he was old enough to stay with Xavier. Winter gradually released its grip on the land. March brought the first tentative signs of spring green shoots pushing through melting snow, longer days, and the return of birdsong to the prairie. Xavier's small herd increased by 4 calves, and he spoke of expanding, perhaps hiring help for the first time. We could build an addition to the cabin, he suggested one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Peter, now nearly 6 months old, babbled happily in Fiona's lap. Another bedroom for Peter when he's older, maybe a proper kitchen for you. Fiona leaned against her husband's shoulder. That sounds wonderful, she said. Then, with studied casualness, we might need more than one additional bedroom eventually. Xavier glanced at her sharply. Fiona, are you saying? She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. Doctor. Wilson confirmed it yesterday when we were in town. Sometime in late October, Peter will have a little brother or sister. joy and concern warred on Xavier's face. "But is it safe, after what you went through with Peter?" "Dr. Wilson says I'm strong and healthy," Fiona assured him. "And this time I'll have proper care throughout. And you," she added, squeezing his hand. Xavier pulled her into his arms, mindful of Peter between them. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find it was all a dream, you, Peter, our life together." "Not a dream," Fiona said, reaching up to touch his face. "Just an unexpected blessing that began on the darkest of nights when I was abandoned at the outskirts and wrapped my baby tight until a cowboy knelt beside me." "Former cavalry," Xavier corrected with a grin. "Not exactly a cowboy," Fiona laughed. "Cowboy, cavalry officer, rancher, whatever you call yourself, you're the man who saved us. And the man I love with all my heart." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier James held his family close, marveling at how the most desperate of circumstances had led to the greatest joy of his life. They had found each other against all odds, and together they would build a future filled with love, purpose, and hope, the most precious commodities on the wild Texas frontier. 5 years later, the schoolhouse bell rang clear across Fort Griffin's Main Street, signaling the end of another day. Fiona James gathered her papers as her students filed out, calling their goodbyes. At 30, with nearly 4 years of teaching behind her, she had become one of the most respected figures in the growing community, Mrs. James. A small voice pulled her attention to the doorway, where 8-year-old Sally Tucker stood hesitantly. "Could you help me with my reading again tomorrow? Pa says if I don't improve, I'll never amount to much." Fiona's heart ached for the girl, whose father was known for his harsh temperament. "Of course, Sally, and you tell your father that Mrs. James says you're already showing great improvement. You'll be reading circles around the rest of us before long." The girl's face brightened. Really, Fiona confirmed. "Now run along home before it gets late." As Sally skipped away, Fiona gathered her belongings and stepped out into the warm May afternoon. Fort Griffin had grown considerably in the past 5 years, with new businesses and homes springing up as the buffalo trade, though diminishing, had brought prosperity to the region. The wild atmosphere that had characterized the flat had somewhat mellowed, though Saturday nights still saw their share of rowdiness. Fiona made her way to the general store, now run by Elizabeth Morgan's son, following his father's passing the previous winter. Inside, she found Xavier holding their daughter, Margaret, while their sons Peter, now 5.5, and 3-year-old Thomas examined the candy display with exaggerated concentration. "1 piece each," Xavier was saying as Fiona approached. "And only if you promise to help with the chores without complaining." "I never complain," Peter declared solemnly, a statement so patently untrue that Fiona had to suppress a laugh. "Hello, my loves," she said, kissing Xavier briefly before taking Margaret from his arms. At 18 months, the little girl was the image of her father, with the same storm-gray eyes and serious expression. "Mama," she crowed, patting Fiona's cheeks with chubby hands. "How were the outlaws today?" Xavier asked, nodding toward the boys who were now earnestly debating the merits of peppermint sticks versus horehound drops. Fiona smiled. "Mostly well-behaved. Mrs. Wilson's twins are going through a mischievous phase, but nothing unmanageable." Mary Wilson had become one of Fiona's closest friends. Their bond forged in that snowy night in the cabin when Fiona had helped bring little Sarah Wilson into the world. Their purchases complete, including the promised candy, the James family headed for their wagon. Their home was now a comfortable 4-room house on the same land where Xavier's cabin had stood. The original structure had been incorporated as the kitchen and living area, with bedrooms added as their family expanded. The ranch had grown too, now boasting a respectable herd of cattle and 2 hired hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn. As they drove home, Peter and Thomas chattered about their day at the fort, where they had been allowed to watch the soldiers drill while Fiona taught her classes. Xavier had arranged his ranch work to accommodate Fiona's teaching schedule, taking the children with him when they were too young for school, and collecting them all for the ride home 3 days a week. Zav, Fiona said quietly as the boys' conversation turned to an animated debate about which of them would be the better horseman. Dr. Wilson wants to speak with us about starting a proper hospital in town. He thinks with the railroad coming next year, Fort Griffin will need better medical facilities. Xavier glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. And you're involved because he wants me to help organize a fund-raising committee, Fiona explained. Says the ladies of the town respect me and the men respect you. Together we might convince people to contribute. Xavier chuckled. The schoolmistress and the rancher changing the face of Fort Griffin, who would have thought it? Are you opposed? Fiona asked. Xavier shook his head. Not at all. It's a good cause and Wilson's right, this place is growing. Proper medical care will be essential. He reached over to squeeze her hand. You've become quite the community leader, Mrs. James. Fiona smiled, thinking of how far they had come. It's amazing what can happen when you're not focused on mere survival anymore. Having security, a home, love, it frees you to think about helping others. As they crested the hill that overlooked their ranch, the setting sun gilded the scene, the sturdy house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn and corrals, the cattle grazing in the distance. It was a tableau of peace and prosperity that neither of them had dared dream of on that cold October night when fate had brought them together. Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Xavier and Fiona sat on their porch, a habit they had maintained through all the seasons of their marriage. The spring air was cool but pleasant, and the stars spread across the Texas sky in a dazzling display. I had a letter from Harriet today, Fiona said, referring to Harriet Morgan, who had moved to Austin 2 years prior. She's been appointed to the State Education Board, the first woman ever to serve. Xavier smiled. That doesn't surprise me, she's formidable. She mentioned something else, Fiona continued, a note of excitement in her voice. The State University in Austin is offering summer courses for teachers. She thinks I should apply for their program next year. Xavier studied his wife's face in the lamplight. Is that something you want to do? Fiona nodded. I think so. It would mean being away for 6 weeks, which seems impossible with the children, but Harriet says I could bring them. She has room in her home. Then you should do it, Xavier said without hesitation. The children and I would manage. Maybe we'd even come visit for a week or two. Fiona leaned against his shoulder. You've never once tried to limit me, she said softly. From that first day, you've encouraged me to grow, to reach for more. Xavier put his arm around her. That's what love is, isn't it? Wanting the person to become their fullest self. He kissed the top of her head. Besides, I'm hardly a traditional husband. Former cavalry officer turned rancher who does the cooking 3 days a week while his wife educates the town's children. Fiona laughed. We've created quite the unconventional life. Regrets? Xavier asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice even after 5 years of marriage. Fiona turned to face him, taking his weathered face between her hands. Not a single one, she said firmly. Every day I thank whatever providence guided you to me that night. You saved more than our lives, Zav. You saved my hope, my future. Xavier's eyes, still as captivating to her as they had been on that first night, held her steadily. You did the same for me, Fiona James. I was existing, not living, before you came into my life. He pulled her closer. I thank God every day for allowing me to find you and Peter, for giving me the chance to love you both. As they sat together under the vast Texas sky, Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate beginning to abundant present, from strangers to beloved family, theirs was a love story born of hardship, but sustained by choice, by daily acts of care and courage, by the decision to build something lasting from the broken pieces life had handed them. And as Xavier's lips found hers in the gentle darkness, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that sometimes, the most unexpected encounters could lead to the greatest joys. That sometimes, being abandoned at the outskirts with nothing but a baby clutched tight to your chest could be the first step on a path to finding not just shelter, but a true and lasting home.